The wind hit them first, a physical blow of grit and fury that scoured the paint from their wagon and clawed at their eyes. It was a maelstrom of crimson dust, a churning wall of the very earth itself rising up to deny them passage. Boone Delaney leaned into the gale. His knuckles white on the reins, the muscles in his jaw locked tight against the relentless assault. Beside him, 7-year-old Clarabelle, huddled under a coarse wool blanket, her small form a silent testament to their desperate flight into this forsaken land. Their new home appeared through the haze not as a sanctuary, but as a skeletal wreck surrendering to the elements. The fence post's skeletal fingers pointing to a hostile sky leaned at impossible angles. The barn, a great groaning beast, had one door torn from its hinges, swinging violently in the wind's grip. This wasn't a home. It was a grave. Papa Clarabelle's voice was a thin thread of sound, nearly stolen by the wind. "Are you sure?" Boone couldn't answer. He could only pull the weary horse to a halt and stare at the ruin he had purchased for a single copper coin. A single coin for his last hope. As he climbed down, the wind tore at his coat, a savage reminder of how precarious their existence had become. He reached into his pocket for the worn leather pouch that held his meager savings, his hand brushing against something hard and smooth within. He needed to secure the wagon tie down the canvas cover before the storm ripped it to shreds. He fumbled with the ropes, his fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold and the tension. It was then that it happened. The object in his pocket, jostled loose by his frantic movements, slipped free. A small hand-carved wooden locket, dark with age, fell from his coat and landed silently in the swirling dust at his feet. He froze. The roar of the wind faded to a dull hum in his ears. The world contracted to that single point on the ground. The locket, a heart-shaped piece of walnut, was all he had left of her. He had carved it himself the year before Clarabelle was born, a clumsy, heartfelt gift for his wife Alara. As he stared at it, the smell of dust and dry earth was replaced by the acrid stench of smoke. The howling wind became the roar of an inferno. The memory struck him with the force of a physical blow. Flames, orange and yellow serpents devoured their small home in the timber town, consuming everything he had ever built with his own 2 hands. He was yards away, returning from the mill, helpless. He could hear the screams, not Alara's, never hers, she was too strong for that, but the panicked shouts of neighbors. He remembered the heat on his face, the suffocating smoke that filled his lungs as he tried to run toward the blaze, held back by a dozen hands. "It's too late, Boone." "The roof is gone," they'd yelled. But all he could see was the window to their bedroom, a black gaping mouth exhaling fire. Alara was in there. The fire had started in the carpentry shop next door, a stray spark from a forge, they said later. A tragic, senseless accident. When they finally pulled her from the ashes, the locket was clutched in her hand, the wood scorched but unbroken. It was the only thing that survived. The wind whipped a sheet of sand into his face, snapping him back to the brutal present. The locket was disappearing, a tiny arc, being swallowed by a red sea of dust. With a strangled cry, Boone threw himself to his knees, his hands scrabbling desperately in the dirt. He dug his fingers raw, ignoring the stinging grit that filled his eyes and nose. For a terrifying moment, it was gone. Another piece of his past, lost to the merciless indifference of the world. Then his fingers brushed against the smooth, familiar curve of the wood. He snatched it up, clutching it in his fist so tightly the edges dug into his palm. The relief was so profound, it left him dizzy. He leaned his forehead against the rough-hewn side of the wagon, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. This ranch, this desolate wreck, had to work. It was more than a property. It was a penance, a chance to build something that wouldn't burn a place where Clarabelle could be safe, a future to atone for the past he had failed to protect. He looked at the house, at its broken windows and peeling walls, and for the first time, he saw not a disaster, but a challenge. He was a carpenter. He had built things from nothing before. He would do it again. He had to. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had arrived, the wall of dust moving on across the plains, leaving behind a world painted in shades of ochre and rust. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the tired snort of their horse. Clarabelle pushed back her blanket, her face smudged with dirt, her wide, observant eyes taking in the devastation. "It just needs some work, sweetheart." Boone said, his voice raspy. He tried to force a confidence he didn't feel. "Nothing we can't handle." He helped her down from the wagon, her small hand warm in his. Their dog Dusty, a scruffy mutt, with an unerring sense of loyalty, hopped down and began sniffing the foreign ground, his tail giving a few hesitant thumps against the wagon wheel. Together, the three of them walked toward the front porch, each step a confirmation of their new reality. The crimson dust clung to everything, like a second skin. The relentless sun, now emerging from the haze, began its work, beating down like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. As they approached the main house, Boone's carpenter's eye began its grim assessment. The foundation seemed solid, but the siding was warped and splintered. The roof was a patchwork of missing shingles. It was a daunting task, but not an impossible one. Then he saw it, the detail that didn't fit. The wooden steps leading to the porch were solid, the planks level and new. Fresh tool marks, the distinct scrape of a plane, and the clean bite of a saw scarred the wood. The nails holding them in place were bright and free of rust. Someone had been here recently, working on these steps with skill and care, while letting the rest of the house crumble into ruin. It made no sense. Why repair the path to a collapsing building? Papa Clarabelle whispered, pointing a small finger. "Those are new boards." Boone knelt, running his hand over the smooth, sanded wood. "They are," he said, his mind churning. A knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. He stood up and pushed the front door. It swung inward with a groan of protest, revealing a room thick with dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. Everything was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of grime, except for a clean path leading from the front door straight through to the back of the house. Dusty, however, showed no interest in the interior. He bolted around the side of the house, his barks echoing in the sudden stillness, sharp, urgent bursts that spoke not of discovery, but of alarm. Dusty Clarabelle started after him, but Boone caught her arm, his grip firm. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low. He followed the dog's path, his senses on high alert. The inconsistencies were piling up, each one a dissonant note in the song of abandonment the ranch was supposed to sing. He saw the next one as they rounded the corner. The back door, unlike the dilapidated front, was fitted with a brand new lock, its brass gleaming against the weathered gray wood. The windows facing the rear of the property were the only ones not boarded up, their glass clean and unbroken, like watchful eyes staring out at the yard. They found Dusty beneath a colossal, gnarled oak tree that dominated the back of the property. Its ancient branches stretched out like protective arms over the house. The dog wasn't chasing a rabbit or a stray cat. He stood stiff-legged, his tail rigid, his nose pointed directly at the ground. He whined a low, anxious sound and pawed at the earth. Boone followed the dog's gaze. The ground at the base of the tree was different, darker. The soil was loose, freshly turned, and had been carefully smoothed over, but not carefully enough to hide the disturbance from a trained eye or an animal's keen nose. Someone had been digging here. Clarabelle tugged at his sleeve, her voice a small, frightened whisper. "Papa, why would someone fix the steps and put on a new lock but leave everything else so broken?" Before Boone could even begin to form an answer, a shadow fell across them. It stretched long and thin in the late afternoon sun, the silhouette of a tall man. They both turned, startled. He was standing at the edge of their property line, watching them. He stood with the quiet patience of a predator, a man who had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal himself. It was not Malachi Brookie, the merchant who had sold them this ruin with a secretive smile. This man's smile, when it came, was not the kind that made you feel welcome. It was the kind that made you check the position of the sun, wondering if you had enough daylight left to run. The stranger approached his steps slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry, dusty ground. He was a tall, lean man, his skin weathered to the texture of old leather by decades under the unforgiving sun. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, seemed to catalog every detail of their arrival. The weary horse, the tattered wagon, the threadbare clothes on their backs. "You must be the new owners," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly drawl. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock politeness. "Name's Ezekiel Marsh. I run the cattle spread just beyond that ridge." He gestured vaguely toward the distant hills without ever taking his gaze off Boone's face. Boone felt Clarabelle press closer to his side, her small hand gripping his pants leg. Dusty had stopped pawing at the ground, and now stood between them and the newcomer, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. "Boone Delaney Boone," answered his voice terse and pragmatic. "This is my daughter, Clarabelle." "Mighty pretty little girl," Ezekiel said. But his tone was flat, carrying an undercurrent that made Boone's protective instincts flare. "Tell me, Mr. Delaney, what exactly did Malachi Brookie tell you about this place?" The question landed with the force of a physical jab. Boone's mind raced, replaying the brief, strange transaction at the trading post. He realized, with a growing, sickening sense of dread, that Malachi had told him almost nothing. Asterisk, the previous owners moved on. Needs someone willing to put in the work. No stories, no history, no explanation for the impossible price. "He said it needed repairs," Boone answered, carefully choosing his words as if navigating a minefield. Ezekiel's laugh was as dry as the desert wind. "Repairs. That's one way to put it." He walked closer to the great oak, his eyes lingering on the spot where Dusty had been digging. The dog held his ground, his growl intensifying. Did he happen to mention why the Hartwell family left in such a hurry, in the middle of the night, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs, or why every able-bodied ranch hand in the territory refuses to set foot on this land? Clarabelle's voice was barely a whisper. "Why won't they work here?" Ezekiel crouched down, his movements fluid and unhurried. He scooped up a handful of the dark, disturbed soil near the tree's base. When he opened his palm, something in the dirt caught the sunlight. Boone's blood ran cold. Tiny flecks of metal, golden and bright, were mixed in with the soil, glittering like scattered fallen stars. Because sometimes, Mr. Delaney, Ezekiel said, letting the soil and its secrets trickle through his fingers, what's buried stays buried for a good reason. And sometimes when folks get too curious about what's hidden under the ground, they find out that some discoveries come with a price far steeper than they're willing to pay. The weight of the unspoken threat hung in the air. Boone felt his mouth go dry. "What are you talking about?" Ezekiel stood and dusted off his hands, his expression shifting to something that might have been mistaken for sympathy if it weren't for the coldness in his eyes. "I'm talking about the fact that Malachi Brookie has been trying to unload this ranch for 3 years. I'm talking about the fact that he always insists on the same terms payment of exactly 1 coin, no more, no less. And I'm talking about the fact that you're the first person desperate enough to accept." The older man turned to leave, then paused, as if struck by a final thought. "One more thing, Mr. Delaney." He glanced from Boone to the disturbed earth and back again. "If I were you, I'd be real careful about what I chose to dig up around that tree." As Ezekiel Marsh walked away, his long shadow merging with the growing twilight, Clarabelle looked up at her father, her young face filled with a fear that mirrored his own. "Papa," she asked, her voice trembling. What did he mean? What's buried here? Before Boone could answer, before he could even begin to process the cryptic warning, Dusty let out a sharp, decisive bark. The dog lunged forward and began digging furiously at the base of the oak, his claws no longer tentative, but frantic, scraping against something hard and unyielding buried just beneath the surface. Boone grabbed for Dusty's collar, but the dog was a whirlwind of focused energy, dirt and dead leaves flying as he dug. Dusty, stop! But the animal ignored him, driven by an instinct Boone couldn't comprehend. Within minutes, the dog's powerful claws had exposed something that made both father and daughter gasp and step back. It was metal. Not just flecks, but the solid dark corner of what appeared to be a large iron box. Its surface was oxidized with age and crusted with earth, but it was unmistakably man-made. The corner jutted up from the ground like the ominous tip of a buried secret, the kind that belonged in dark fables, not in the harsh, unforgiving reality of their new life. Papa Clarabelle breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and terror. "Is that a treasure chest?" Boone knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He brushed more of the loose soil away from the exposed metal. The box was real substantial. His carpenter's hands, accustomed to the feel of wood and the heft of tools, traced the edges. He felt for seams, for joints, for any sign of its construction. This was no hastily buried trinket. This was heavy forged iron, carefully constructed and concealed with the intention of it staying hidden for a very long time. But as his hands cleared more of the surface, a deeper chill settled over him, one that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. He saw them now, undeniable, in the soft dirt, fresh shovel marks scoring the earth around the perimeter of the burial site. The soil itself had the compressed, layered look of dirt that had been recently excavated and then carefully, methodically replaced. Ezekiel's warning echoed in his mind. Someone had been here before them. Someone who knew exactly where to dig. Clarabelle stepped back, he said, his voice sharper than he intended. The little girl obeyed without question, her eyes wide and fixed on the emerging box. She took a few steps back, her hand finding Dusty's coarse fur for comfort. "How big do you think it is?" That was the question that truly worried Boone. The more dirt he scraped away, the larger the container revealed itself to be. What had started as a single corner now suggested a shape the size of a small coffin. It was buried shallow enough to be found, but deep enough that unearthing it would require serious, back-breaking effort. Suddenly, Dusty stopped digging. The dog backed away from the hole, his ears flattened against his skull, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. His behavior sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Boone. An animal's fear was honest. It was a primal alarm that humans with their logic and reason often missed until it was too late. From the direction of the house came the sound of approaching footsteps. Not the measured, deliberate walk of Ezekiel Marsh, but the quick, purposeful stride of someone who wasn't visiting someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. Boone shot to his feet, instinctively moving to place himself between Clarabelle and whoever was about to round the corner of the house. He braced himself, his mind racing through a dozen terrible possibilities. When the figure appeared silhouetted against the dying light, his stomach twisted into a knot of cold dread. It was Malachi Brookie, and he was carrying a shovel. "Well now, I see you found my little insurance policy," Malachi said. The jovial, folksy mask he wore at the trading post was gone, stripped away to reveal something hard and predatory beneath. His face was a canvas of calculation, his eyes fixed not on Boone, but on the partially excavated iron box. "I was wondering how long it would take you." Clarabelle grabbed her father's arm. "Papa, what's he talking about? What does he mean?" Malachi stepped closer, the shovel held casually at his side, but positioned for a swift, brutal swing. "I'm talking about the reason I could only sell this place for 1 coin, little girl," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier warmth. He looked directly at Boone, his intent as clear as the new lock on the back door. "I'm talking about the reason you're going to help me finish what I started here. Because what's in that box doesn't belong to you. It never did. And the good folks who put it there are going to be coming back to collect it. Very, very soon. The afternoon sun seemed to vanish, plunged behind the distant hills as Malachi's words sank in. Whatever was buried beneath the ancient oak tree was not a treasure to be found, but a burden to be borne. And with that single copper coin, Boone had not bought a ranch. He had bought himself and his daughter into the middle of a dangerous game where they were nothing but disposable pawns. Boone sized up the merchant. Malachi was not a large man, but the shovel in his hands was a great equalizer. More than that, it was the chilling calm in his eyes that was truly menacing. This was a man pushed past desperation into something far more dangerous. "What people, Boone?" asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. A conscious effort to betray none of the fear clawing at his insides. "And what's in the box?" Malachi's smile was as cold and thin as a shard of winter ice. "Let's just say it represents a business transaction that went sideways. The kind where all the partners involved had to lay low for a spell." He gestured with the shovel toward the partially exposed container. The Hartwell family, they were supposed to be minding the store. Good, quiet folk. But they got spooked. Ran off in the dead of night, leaving me to clean up their mess. Clarabelle pressed herself against her father's leg, her small hand clutching his trousers. Dusty stood his ground, the growl in his chest a constant low thrum. The dog understood. Malachi was a threat. So you needed a new caretaker, Boone said, the terrible logic of it all clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. You found someone desperate enough to buy the ranch for a song, knowing they'd eventually stumble upon your problem. Exactly, Malachi affirmed, taking another step toward the hole. And now you're going to help me dig it up. All of it. The men who left it here, they sent word. They're riding back to collect their investment. They're due by sunset tomorrow, and they ain't the kind of gentlemen who appreciate excuses or complications. The full weight of their situation crashed down on Boone. He had seen this ranch as a chance to build, to protect, to atone. Instead, he had unwittingly led his daughter into a cage. He was the new gatekeeper of some criminal enterprise, and the owners were coming to call. And if I refuse, he asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He already knew the answer. Malachi's expression remained unchanged, but his knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on the shovel's worn wooden handle. Then your sweet Clarabelle there grows up an orphan, and I dig this thing up myself. One way or another, that box is coming out of the ground before sunrise. As the merchant laid out his brutal ultimatum, Boone noticed something. A flicker, a crack in the man's cold facade. Malachi's eyes kept darting nervously toward the dilapidated house, then toward the dusty track that served as a road. He was scared. He wasn't just worried about the gang arriving tomorrow. He was afraid of something else, something more immediate. Clarabelle, ever watchful, tugged at her father's shirt. "Papa," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost on the evening air. "If the bad men are coming tomorrow, why is he so scared right now?" The child's simple, devastating question hit Boone like a bolt of lightning. She was right. Malachi's fear was palpable, a live thing in the air between them. He wasn't just anxious, he was terrified. And the way his gaze kept sweeping the horizon suggested that whatever or whoever he was afraid of might already be much closer than anyone realized. Before Boone could voice this thought, a new sound intruded upon the tense silence. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder, it was the unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. Not one rider, but several. And they were moving fast, a purposeful drumming beat that spoke of urgency and intent. They were heading straight for the ranch. Malachi's face drained of all color, leaving it a sickly pasty white. His feigned confidence shattered like cheap glass. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "No, not yet. They're not supposed to be here until tomorrow." He turned to Boone, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate panic. "Get the shovel. We need to get that box out of the ground now. If they find us like this, we're all dead." The riders were closing in their hoofbeats, a thunderous promise of violence. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The secret buried under the oak tree had just become a matter of life and death, and Boone Delaney finally understood the true price of that single copper coin. It had bought him and his daughter a front-row seat to a reckoning. The thunder of hooves grew to a deafening roar. Malachi, his composure utterly gone, threw himself to his knees beside the hole, clawing at the earth with his bare hands. "Help me!" he shrieked at Boone, his voice cracking with terror. "If they find us standing here empty-handed, they won't ask questions." There was no choice. Boone snatched the second shovel, the one Malachi had brought, and plunged it into the earth. He dug with the fierce, desperate efficiency of a man who had spent his life in physical labor, his muscles screaming in protest. Each shovelful of dirt felt like a second ticking off their lives. Clarabelle, her face pale, scrambled behind the wide trunk of the oak, with Dusty, her small fingers twisting in the dog's fur as the sound of the approaching riders filled the air. "Papa, who are they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It was Malachi who answered, spitting the words out between ragged breaths. "Bank robbers, Silas Ward's crew. They hit the Territorial Bank in Millfield 3 months back. Made off with a fortune gold coin, government bonds, the works. They buried it here to let the heat die down." Boone's shovel struck the iron box with a jarring clang. He and Malachi worked in a frenzied tandem, clearing the remaining dirt. The container was even larger than he'd imagined, nearly 4 feet long, and 2 wide, bound with heavy iron straps and clasps, sealed with thick wax to keep out the damp. The riders were so close now that Boone could hear their voices' rough, guttural calls to one another as they neared the ranch house. Malachi's face was as white as a bleached bone. "That's him," he hissed, his hands fumbling with the wax seals. "That's Silas Ward. They trusted me because I was just a harmless old merchant. When the Hartwells bolted, I panicked. I had to find someone, anyone, to put on the land to make it look normal." The grotesque logic of it all was now painfully clear. Malachi hadn't sold him the ranch to make him the guardian of the treasure. He had sold it to make him the scapegoat. If the gang returned to find their loot disturbed or missing, they would kill the new owner without a second thought. Suddenly, Clarabelle gasped, "Papa, look." In their frantic haste, they had broken a corner of the iron lid. Through the crack, even in the fading light, they could see the contents. Gold coins, minted and bright, glinted like captured sunlight. They were stacked in neat, tight rolls nestled beside thick bundles of official-looking paper bound with red ribbon. Malachi stared, mesmerized. "There's got to be 50,000 in gold alone," he whispered, a strange, greedy light flickering in his terrified eyes. "And those bonds, if they're government issue, they could be worth twice that." The sound of horses pulling up in the yard shattered the moment. 5 riders, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the setting sun, had arrived. Their shoulders were set hard and their hands rested with casual familiarity on the pistols at their hips. Silas Ward's voice sliced through the evening air, sharp and cold as a razor. "Malachi, we need to have a little chat." Clarabelle grabbed her father's arm, her small body shaking. "Papa, what happens now?" Malachi was already on his feet, frantically trying to brush the fresh dirt from his clothes, composing his features into a mask of nervous welcome. His next words, whispered to Boone, made his blood run cold. "They can never know we opened this. They can never know we even saw inside." His eyes were wide with a primal fear. "The only people who've ever seen the contents of that box and lived to tell about it are the ones who helped rob that bank." Silas Ward dismounted with the fluid, dangerous grace of a panther. He was lean and elegantly dressed for a man of his profession, his movements economical and precise. His eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. The smile on his face was a polite, chilling curve that promised cruelty. The 4 men with him fanned out, creating a loose, inescapable perimeter around the oak tree, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. Malachi Brookie Silas set his voice a silken, articulate purr that was more menacing than any shout. "You look nervous, my friend. That's not a good look on you." Malachi took a half-step forward unconsciously, trying to block their view of the disturbed earth. It was a clumsy, obvious gesture, and Silas's sharp eyes caught it immediately. An interesting spot for a garden party. Silas observed his gaze sweeping over the loose dirt, the discarded shovels, and the frantic look in Malachi's eyes. He walked closer, his polished boot heel grinding against a piece of dark metal half buried in the soil. The sound made everyone freeze. One of Silas's men, a brutish giant with a face like a slab of granite, bent down and picked up the fragment. He held it up to the dying light. It was a corner piece of the iron box lid sheared off in their haste. "Boss," the big man grunted, "looks like a piece of our deposit box." The temperature seemed to plummet. Silas's polite facade dissolved, replaced by a cold, deadly stillness. His hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, an ivory-handled Colt. His 4 men mirrored the action. The unspoken threat had become a declaration of intent. Silas turned his attention to Boone. "And you are," he asked, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "This is the new owner," Malachi blurted out, his voice high and strained. "Boone Delaney. Bought the place this morning. He was just clearing some dead roots from around the tree." Silas's laugh was sharp and brittle like breaking glass. Dead roots. How fascinating. His eyes, however, were fixed on Boone's face, then on Clarabelle, who was trying to make herself invisible behind her father's legs. Silas's gaze lingered on Boone, a flicker of something not recognition, but a deeper, more unsettling assessment in their depths. It was as if he were trying to place Boone not in the present, but in the past. Then his eyes traveled back to the ground. He took another step, and his boots scuffed against the solid iron lid of the box itself, now barely concealed by a thin layer of hastily replaced dirt. The silence stretched taut and unbearable. Clarabelle looked up at her father, her eyes huge and terrified, understanding in her innocent way that their lives now balanced on a knife's edge. And in that moment of terrible, suffocating quiet, Dusty, loyal and protective to the last, made a choice. With a defiant bark, the dog lunged forward and began digging furiously at the loose soil, uncovering in seconds the dark, damning truth of the iron box for all to see. Silas Ward's expression shifted from cold suspicion to absolute chilling certainty. His gun cleared its leather holster with the impossible speed of a striking rattlesnake. The metallic click of the Colt's hammer being cocked was the loudest sound in the world. But before Silas could level the barrel, a single deafening crack of a rifle shot split the evening air. It came not from the circle of men, but from the direction of the ranch house. Silas cried out, stumbling backward, as his hat was torn from his head by the force of the bullet. It spun through the air, a perfect neat hole drilled clean through the crown. "I wouldn't move another inch if I were you, Ward." The voice was Ezekiel Marsh's. He emerged from the deep shadows behind the ranch house, a heavy Winchester rifle resting snugly against his shoulder, its barrel trained squarely on the gang leader's chest. He wasn't alone. 3 other men, grim-faced and armed with rifles of their own, stepped out from concealed positions around the barn and shed their weapons, covering Silas's stunned companions. Ezekiel Malachi's voice cracked a choked sound of confusion and betrayal. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 3 months ago," Ezekiel replied, his calm, measured voice a stark contrast to the chaos. He never took his eyes off Silas. "Boone, get your girl behind that tree. Stay down." Boone didn't need to be told twice. He scooped Clarabelle into his arms and dove behind the massive solid trunk of the oak, his mind reeling. What was happening? A cattle rancher playing lawman, but Clarabelle, with the sharp, unfiltered perception of a child, saw the truth. "Papa, look," she whispered, pointing from their refuge. "The man has a badge." Ezekiel had moved into a sliver of the fading light. Pinned to his vest, partially hidden beneath his dusty coat, was a silver star glinting dully. Ezekiel Marsh wasn't their neighbor. He was the law. Deputy U.S. Marshal Ezekiel Marsh, the man announced, his voice carrying with official authority. "Silas Ward, you and your men are under arrest for the robbery of the Millfield Territorial Bank and for the murder of 2 bank clerks during that crime." Silas's face was a mask of furious disbelief. "How long have you known?" he spat. "Since the day you buried that box," Ezekiel answered calmly. "We've been watching this place, waiting for you to come back and claim your property. You were the bait to catch the rest of your associates." The pieces slammed together in Boone's mind. The 1 coin price, the isolation, the strange warnings. It was all a trap. And Malachi, "You don't understand." Malachi cried, his voice hysterical, as he looked from Ezekiel to Silas. "I wasn't working with him. I was trying to get rid of it. I was scared." Ezekiel's expression hardened. "Then you're under arrest too, Brookie. Accessory after the fact." The confrontation had become a deadly 3-way standoff. Silas's men, though covered by rifles, were subtly shifting their weight, their hands inching toward their guns. The air was electric, ready to explode. As the tension mounted, Boone dug inside the box, his hands searching for something, anything he could use. His fingers closed around something solid that wasn't a coin. It was a small leather-bound book, the Hartwell family's journal. He shoved it into his coat. Then his hand found something else, a loose, faded photograph tucked between bundles of bonds. He pulled it out. The image was of 2 people standing in front of a newly built mine head. One was a younger, happier Ilara. His Ilara. And standing next to her, his arm casually resting on her shoulder, was a man he had never seen before, but whose face he now recognized with a gut-wrenching shock. It was a young, clean-shaven Silas Ward. The world tilted. This wasn't a random robbery. This wasn't a stranger's crime. This was personal. Before he could process the impossible connection, Silas Ward's eyes met his across the short distance. And in that moment, the flicker of assessment in the outlaw's gaze ignited into full, shocking recognition. Delaney Silas breathed his voice, a low, venomous whisper. "Ilara's husband. Well, I'll be damned." He threw his head back and laughed, a chilling, mirthless sound. "You want to know what the real treasure is in that box, Marshal? It ain't just the gold." He pointed a finger at Boone. "It's the deed to this land. And the original partnership papers for the Black Creek mine. Papers that prove my late partner, Jebediah Kane, that would be my dear Ilara's father, cheated me. This land, this money, it was all rightfully mine from the start." The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it stole Boone's breath. Ilara's father had died in a mine collapse, a tragedy that had broken her mother and eventually driven Ilara from her home, leading her to the timber town where she met Boone. Silas was twisting history, rewriting the past to justify his crimes. The box didn't just hold stolen gold. It held the truth. The truth about Silas Ward, the truth about the mine, and the truth about the tragedy that had shaped his wife's life and indirectly led to her death. This fight was no longer about survival. It was about justice for Ilara. Silas, emboldened by the revelation, made his move. He gambled that he was faster than a man holding a heavy rifle. He was wrong. The Winchester barked once. The shot was not for Silas, but for the man beside him who had drawn his weapon. As that man fell, the yard erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. It was a maelstrom of smoke, noise, and chaos. In the confusion, Malachi Brookie made a desperate, cowardly decision. He saw his chance not for freedom, but for greed. He lunged for the open box, scooping up a canvas bag heavy with gold coins. He tried to scramble away to flee into the twilight, but he ran directly into the line of fire. A stray bullet caught him in the leg. He collapsed with a scream, the bag of gold spilling its glittering contents into the dust. The gunfight was brutal and short. Ezekiel and his men were professionals, their shots precise and deadly. When the smoke cleared, Silas's gang was either dead or grievously wounded. But Silas himself was still standing. In the final desperate moments of the firefight, he saw his only way out. Clarabelle, terrified by the noise, had moved from behind the tree and was now huddled behind the relative safety of the wagon. It wasn't enough. With a final desperate lunge, Silas grabbed her. He dragged the screaming child in front of him, using her small body as a shield. The barrel of his ivory-handled Colt pressed against her temple. "Drop your weapons," Silas screamed, his voice raw with panic and rage. "All of you, or the girl dies." Ezekiel froze his rifle half-raised. His men held their fire. The world fell silent again, the only sounds Clarabelle's terrified sobs and Silas's ragged breathing. "You, Delaney," Silas snarled, his eyes locking onto Boone. "You know what I really want. It's not the gold. It's the papers, the partnership agreement, and the deed. They're in the box. Get them for me. Now." Boone's world narrowed to 2 points, the cold black muzzle of the gun pressed against his daughter's head, and the iron box full of documents that could prove Silas a liar and a murderer, bringing justice for Alara's family. The setting sun cast long, confusing shadows across the yard. A rising wind began to howl through the branches of the ancient oak, a mournful, eerie sound. Ezekiel's voice was low and steady. "Don't do it, Boone. That evidence is the only thing that will hang him." But Boone was no longer listening to the marshal. He was looking past Silas, his carpenter's eye, seeing not a battleground, but a structure. The old, dilapidated barn. One of its main support beams, the one nearest them, was rotten through at the base, barely holding the weight of the hayloft above. A heavy coil of rope used for hoisting bales was still slung over it. If that beam gave way, he had a choice. A terrible, impossible choice. The evidence that could clear his wife's family name and see her father's killer brought to justice. Or his daughter's life. It was no choice at all. "All right, Silas," Boone said, his voice surprisingly calm. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "You win." He walked slowly toward the iron box, his movements deliberate. He knelt his back to Silas and the barn. He pretended to search through the papers, his hands trembling. But his eyes were on the ground. He found what he was looking for, a loose rock, heavy and palm-sized. He slipped it into his hand. "Just give me the papers," Delaney. Silas shrieked, his nerves starting to break. "I'm getting them," Boone said. Then, in one fluid, desperate motion, he spun and hurled the rock not at Silas, but at the frayed, weathered rope looped over the rotten support beam of the barn. The rock struck the rope with a solid thud. The old hemp, already strained, snapped. The heavy block and tackle fell slamming against the rotted base of the support beam. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning crack that sounded like the earth itself splitting apart, the beam shattered. The entire corner of the hayloft collapsed inward with a thunderous roar, sending a cascade of timber, hay, and debris crashing to the ground. The cloud of dust and chaos was instantaneous and absolute. Silas, startled by the noise, flinched instinctively, his grip on Clarabelle loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Ezekiel Marsh needed. The marshal's Winchester fired. The shot was perfect. Silas Ward crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror ended in a cloud of dust and shattered timber. Boone was already moving, sprinting across the yard. He snatched Clarabelle from the ground, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight as she sobbed into his shoulder. He ran his hands over her, checking for injuries, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. She was safe. She was safe. In the aftermath, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The surviving gang members, wounded and defeated, were shackled. Ezekiel Marsh walked over to Boone, his face grim but etched with relief. He knelt beside Silas's body and retrieved the partnership papers and the deed from the outlaw's coat pocket where he had presumably intended to hide them. "He was lying," Ezekiel said, handing the documents to Boone. "These papers show your wife's father, Jebediah Kane, was the majority partner. Silas Ward here doctored a copy to make it look like he was cheated. The truth is, he orchestrated the accidental mine collapse that killed Kane so he could seize control. The Hartwells who lived here before you were distant relatives of one of the bank clerks Silas murdered. He forced them to hide his treasure, threatening to do the same to them if they refused. They fled as soon as they had the chance. Boone looked down at the papers, the elegant script, a testament to a crime that had poisoned his family's past. He now held the proof that would not only convict Silas posthumously, but would also legally grant Boone the clear and unassailable title to the ranch which had originally belonged to Jebediah Kane. The reward for the capture of this gang is substantial. Ezekiel continued, his voice softer now. The government and the Bankers Association posted $50,000. With the recovered assets, you'll be a wealthy man, Mr. Delaney. You've earned it. Later, as Ezekiel's men loaded the prisoners and the dead onto a wagon, Boone saw Malachi Brookie being helped to his feet, his leg bandaged. The merchant looked at Boone, his face a mixture of pain, shame, and regret. "I'm sorry," Malachi whispered, his voice hoarse. "I never wanted any of this. I was just scared." Boone looked at the man who had nearly cost him and his daughter their lives. He saw not a villain, but a weak man who had made a series of terrible choices. Fear makes us do things we never thought we could. Boone said, his voice flat and tired. It was all the forgiveness he could offer. Months later, the ranch was no longer a wreck. It was a home. The reward money had been more than enough. The fence was straight and strong. The barn stood tall and true with a new roof, and every window in the restored house gleamed in the sun, reflecting the endless blue sky. Boone had found another surprise. The small leather-bound journal he'd pulled from the box, written by Mrs. Hartwell, had contained more than just a record of their fear. On the last page was a hand-drawn map. It led not to buried gold, but to something far more valuable in this arid land, a hidden year-round spring tucked away in a small canyon on the far edge of the property. It was a source of clean, endless water, ensuring the ranch's future prosperity. A final desperate gift from one family to the next. One cool autumn evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple over the plains, Boone walked with Clarabelle to the top of a small hill that overlooked their thriving home. In his hands, he carried a wooden marker. He had spent weeks carving it from a solid timber he had salvaged from the old broken-down ranch house. He had taken a piece of the wreckage of his past and fashioned it into a tribute for his future. He placed the marker at the head of a simple, unmarked grave, where he had reinterred Alara's ashes brought with them on their long journey. The inscription was simple asterisk, Alara Kane Delaney, beloved wife and mother. Finally home. Clarabelle laid a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. She leaned against her father, her small hand finding his. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight wash over the land. The ghosts of the past were finally quiet. The grief, once a crushing weight, was now a gentle memory, a part of the foundation upon which he had built this new life. He was no longer a man haunted by what he had lost, but a man defined by what he had built, by his resilience, and by the boundless hope he saw reflected in his daughter's eyes.